Hey YouTube, it's Jen. I just wanted to share with you guys my unedited API testing challenge video submission for the Ministry of Testing. We've got Test.bash 2022 coming up in just a couple of days. I'm really excited to go. I hope that you're going to be there. So anyway, kick back and enjoy. Hello, my name is Jen Bauer. I'm a QA engineer, API testing enthusiast and educator, and this is my entry for the Ministry of Testing's Test.bash API Challenge for the year 2022. I wanted to give you just a quick overview about some of the things that we're going to be talking through today. And it also gives you kind of an idea of what my approach is for this challenge. We're going to start off with just taking a look at what our goals are for working through this. What's in scope and what isn't in scope is always a good idea. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of how I've set up Postman. And then I'm going to talk through my tinkering and kind of exploring of the API documentation and what was made available. Then we're going to show you, how I've built some of the tests that are related to the challenge. And then I'm just going to recap and see if we did what we set out to do and provide some, other details there. So let's talk about what the goal is. We want to solve for the Rooms API being unable to create rooms, right? We want to make sure that you can actually have rooms be created as one would expect. Now, this RESTful Booker API is essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it's just a way of mimicking like a hotel setup where you have rooms and you want to be able to book those rooms and you want to be able to look up some marketing info. It's super fun, so it's great to be able to use this for our test purposes. Of course, part of our goal is that we want to automate an API test to verify this particular API that's being called out. Also, we're going to use an admin account login to complete this action. And then one of the other aspects of the challenge is just to talk about where the strengths are and maybe where are the less great things about whatever particular tooling we choose to use. So I'm going to try to note those as they come up. So let's talk about our testing scope. So as we just mentioned, what the goal is to test this Rooms API and being able to create a room. That's really the main goal here, so it's pretty straightforward. So there may be other functions of the Rooms API, and we're going to say that those are out of scope for the time being here. I'm also going to put our unhappy path tests out of scope for this assignment, just because I would like to be able to complete this in a reasonable amount of time. But this would be something that you would consider, of course, if you were making a very robust API test suite. Other API endpoints within the RESTful Booker API are going to be out of scope unless they're part of the flow involved in creating a room successfully. So we're going to take a look at that in just a little bit here. All right, so let's talk about setting up Postman, my favorite. So I should mention here that I've chosen Postman for my tooling. We've got a lot of other options that are out there in the wild that you can use in other test frameworks. I really enjoy Postman because it's both very accessible and you can actually have it be very visible to other members of your team who may be less technical, but you can also do a lot of great automation and things like that as well. So let's get on to Postman here. We have several import options. So there is actually an existing Postman public collection by the Ministry of Testing that you can, within Postman, you can copy it, you can export it, you can fork it. You have lots of options to be able to use that as a base. There is also an open API spec, and you can export that from the Swagger link. So I'm going to show you that real quick here. If you go to this Swagger UI, you can see that we're in the Room API here. So we can go ahead and look at rooms, and just taking a look here real quick, your get, your put, your delete, being able to actually get multiple, and of course creating the room is actually in this post request here. So, but I'm not here for that reason here. I just wanted to show you that if you click on this link right here under Open API Definition, you actually get this nice little bit of JSON, and you can import that into Postman as well if there, say, was not a collection. And that's very helpful just out in the wild in case you come across an API that you're trying to learn more about. Just getting that first import can give you a nice leg up. I'm going to be looking at the Swagger UI spec anyway, so I just copied from the Postman space, but of course you guys can do however you like. So one key point I want to note is that if you're importing from a Postman collection, you want to check if there's an environment in use as well. There are folks who will do tons of work without an environment. Some folks are very environment heavy. It just depends on the API. An export or import is needed. In this case, it did actually have a little bit of URL information for the base of the URL, so I made sure to go ahead and grab that also. All right, so let's go into exploring and tinkering. So let's take a look at this API and see what we can do. So I started with the auth request and just being able to log in. The username and password credentials work as is, so I can show you that here real quick. Just taking a look here, and actually I'm going to talk through a little bit of the structure over here, but it's just so much fun to just start doing. So I'm going to go to this auth under the auth API as opposed to the rooms API. Auth is a separate piece here. So as we said earlier, this is in scope because we want to be able to log in. So that's a-okay to do here. I've got an account user, an account password. These are set up as environment variables, and so we can take a look over here. I've got some other information that we're going to see in a little bit, but this actually has the username and the password. Now, this is a test API, so the user, I believe the username is just like admin and the password is password. But I would love to show you a good practice here in case you're ever working with something that's not quite so you know, publicly accessible, but Postman has a way within an environment variable here that you can set whether or not something is a secret or not. So there's two pieces here to call out. One, of course, is that you can have just these default variable values, so things that are maybe not necessarily confidential. But then you have this new option that's called secret. So secret is what I opted to use here for the username and for the password, just because I want to make sure that I was putting in a good practice here as if this was a little bit more, you know, serious. Another piece that I'd like to call out also is the initial value versus the current value. The initial value is synced if you are using Postman with the cloud that is your account and all the wonderful things you make in collections, etc., including these environments here. So if you potentially have like a shared space and you want to have that information shared, the initial value is the spot to go to give everyone the same default value the first time that they hop in. However, this current value here, if you want to just use this, that will ensure that it stays local to your local install of Postman or wherever you're using it, and it does not sync to the cloud. So I tend to put passwords and authentication things both in that current value field, and you know, just try to keep that separate from the initial value just so it doesn't sync up. Again, we're just playing with the RESTful Booker API, so there's nothing critical or crazy going on here, but I just would love to show you guys a best practice here in this form as well. Okay, so let's go back here. So we were able to log in. We got a 200 okay, things are looking good. We can take a look at, there's nothing that's coming back in the body, it's just the 200 okay, but we do have in the cookies that we get a token, so Postman will be able to use this for the upcoming requests and authorization. So things are looking good here. Now, another thing that I consider just kind of like a best practice, if you can, is there a health or a ping request? Is there something that I can just send a request to and get an okay that's not necessarily tied to business logic or other, you know, activities that are going on, just so I can see, is this API itself okay? Are we online? Are things looking good? And then the difference between that and of course all the other results will give me a better idea how things are going. Because if you have some sort of like a baseline issue, it's much easier to call that out if there is a request and an assertion that's dedicated to just that. All right, so, and we found a health endpoint, which is great. So I started with that, and I have that set up in the request as well. All right, so what can we do related to rooms? So we're taking a look at the API to see what some of those things were, and we actually just looked at this a little bit earlier because I wanted to get an idea if there were any, you know, additional behaviors. So going back to the open API for the room API. We were talking through that there's a get specific to an ID. So if you want to get one room's information, the put is for updating that particular room. Of course, we can also delete a room. And we have this get here, which will get you multiple rooms back. You can actually get potentially more than one, although the example only shows one here. But again, that's the reading between the lines of the API spec and trying to sort out that that's the case, and that makes a lot of sense to me here. And then of course the post is for creating rooms. So within the room API itself, we have essentially these 5 options. Now, aside from creating a room, you know, the options that I talked about here, I was like, hey, could we create more than one room at once? I tried that, not quite so much. It's really just one at a time. So we can also, there are essentially, aside from creating a room, which is the core of our mission here, we have all these related follow-up actions. So it makes sense to me as a QA engineer to use that create room in addition to checking up on all of these related actions as well within this API. So you could definitely argue either way that these other actions are in scope or not. I went with it because I felt like they were, you know, similar enough within the API, but I could see an argument either way depending on your opinion on it. Now, there are also other API endpoints that relate to rooms and other APIs, so the booking and the report APIs, but I decided to skip those for this exercise because the scope really just is creating rooms, and we can within this API verify that pretty easily. But if that weren't the case, then I would take a look at the other APIs and possibly include them if I wanted some other way to verify that things are looking healthy. All right, so let's talk about building tests. So I want to show you how I organize my tests by scenario. I think everybody has a different opinion on how to do this within Postman. But because there is generally within a collection, you have the options of folders, and it'll run things in the order that you specify. I like to just be like kind of almost overly verbose in what my scenarios are in the order that I'm expecting them to run in. So what I have here is like the health check is first. And then I have these 4 additional scenarios. Now, some folks will say create room should have been all by itself in one of these scenarios as opposed to having the others. Again, I think that's a matter of taste. Me running create room by itself or with someone else, it's good. If it's going to fail, it's going to fail. And we can make it really obvious that that's where the failure is. So, you know, that's entirely up to your preferences there. But for our scenario here, I decided to roll it into the other 4 endpoints there. So that's what you can see here, that I've got a lot of numbering. I like to be really wordy in my descriptions here and put in the order that, you know, I'm building things in. Oh yeah, and I forgot to call out, I like to alternate between letters and numbers. You can just do all numbers, you could do all letters, whatever you like, but I just like to do it in a way that to me is, you know, very readable. So I'm also thinking about whether or not we're going to keep the environment variables at this point. I wasn't really clear if we were going to, you know, use it beyond the request URLs. I ended up using it so that when I'm running the test in Postman, a request at a time, it's kind of like having a console log at the ready, because it's going to go ahead and save that current value up there, so you can just take a peek at it very easily. But if I was running this for a purely like, you know, automated, like a GitHub action scenario or Newman or something like that, I might just change them all to variables and not have them necessarily saved to the environment. But, you know, it's not, I don't think it's a real big performance hit either way. So what do we want to verify? We've got a lot of different things that we can think about when we're talking about APIs, right? Security, we want to use the authorization flow and actually, like, you know, make sure that it actually uses the account. You could do, like I was talking about earlier, some unhappy paths, so you could deliberately try some credentials that you know will not work and then try the follow-ups on those. I didn't automate it, but I did verify it through just testing and monkeying around, but that's another piece that we could add in here. Validation, like per each request, do we receive all the things that we expect, right? Looking at the Swagger UI and what those responses are, just making sure that things line up that way with our expectations. Also, if there is like a business logic or a workflow, you know, if I move through multiple requests in a sequence, just as if I was the app, does this, you know, behave as I expect? So then I built some tests. So let me talk a little bit about some of the Postman tips and tricks that I've got in my process here. So I mentioned earlier that I use environment variables for some quick debugging, just because it's going to save the value of those variables in the environment menu there. So that's really nice for just building quickly. I also mentioned the initial value versus the current value, and also that you can have default and secret values for your environment variables. But yeah, let's go ahead and let's dig into some assertions. So we're back here at the beginning here. This is our auth. So we can take a look at the very first one that I have here, which is for the ping. Now the ping doesn't have any body. It's just hitting the URL. So really we're just taking a look to see a couple of things based on this response of up. So I would say you would most likely, if things are not looking well, I don't know that you necessarily get a down, but you would get, you probably wouldn't get anything at all, and you certainly wouldn't be a 200. So let's talk a little bit about some of these pieces that I have here. I like to put in this scenario name. If you're thinking about a collection possibly becoming something that runs in Newman or somewhere else, you may lose a little bit of that, some of the reporting that you see in the Postman UI that just makes it kind of friendlier and easier to skim over. So sometimes I'll just put in, you know, some test details there, and it's essentially an assertion that always passes because it's got no no logic to validate against. So it's an easy kind of hacky way that you can get some extra info in there if you need it. Of course, I'm going to just do an HTTP status code request here. Are we at 200? What's fun for some of these other requests coming up is they're not necessarily always 200s. There's like 201s and 202s depending on which request it is. So just making sure that things are looking good there. I also just like to verify that the status is up, and I like to be, again, I'm sort of a wordy creature, so I like to come back with the health status is up, right? So like, why don't we return the up as opposed to just saying that it's okay? So if I can't ever return, you know, the value of something that's going on, I like to do that just so it's a little bit easier to read and skim, and you'll have some more information if things are not going well. Another piece that I like to add in is, again, I'm typically working with like Newman and automating that way. So just as a creature of habit, one of my tips here for you is that you can say, hey, you know, if the response code is not positive, go ahead and return the request body and the response body. So if there's something that's not right, go ahead and bring that back. There are a lot of different ways that you can do that if you want to, but I found that for debugging when things go poorly, it's nice to have that information there. All right. Let's see what we have here. So let's go to something that's a little more exciting. If I go ahead and I'm going to log in to get my token here, and then I'm going to go create a room. So this is the excitement. This is what we're all here for. This request will have a room name, the type of room, whether it's accessible or not, an image, which could be used for marketing, a description, a room price, and an array that has different features. So I'm going to show you how I've set this up in the pre-request script, so I can copy and paste this and make adjustments here. And if this were a more like complex scenario where there were maybe some very specific combinations of room types and accessibility and pricing and things that perhaps the API would not allow, what I would probably do is take this and expand it out to use iteration data to cover even more scenarios than just the ones that I have set up in Postman here. And it's very easy to extend into that from the pre-request script. But for now, we're just doing the environments, we're just having fun and taking a look at some of these different randomizations that I've got here. So I've got a little bit of just low-dash random numbers here. I also have some of the Postman dynamic variables, which are really fun. So I hadn't heard about random catchphrase until today, so I had to give that a go. So we have a description, and then they have an abstract image URL that you can grab, and then I just added a little bit of other fun stuff here. So we can go ahead and send this. And I've made room ID number 2 for Gen Test Room. Everything's looking good. We're at 201. Our tests are passing. And for this, I did do some more complicated re-engineered bifurcated groupware. Oh my gosh, I love these catchphrases. They're so fun. Highly recommended. But anyway, my testing here is a little bit more involved now than from when we were looking at the ping. So again, I'm looking at the status code, but now I'd like to take a look and do some comparisons to my test data along with the request data that I sent. So I have some here to test here to say match what we set for the request and for the response. So this is against my test data from the pre-request script. I've got all kinds of assertions here and just saying, hey, does this match the room that I set this for? And then I have some tests for matching what the request and the response have. So just verifying based on that raw response, just parsing it to get those values out and comparing it to what we received back. Now in this case, they're very similar, right? So for this example, it's kind of a little bit redundant to see so much of what we sent being, parroted back to us. The only difference really is that we get a room ID. But in other cases and with other APIs, it's a good practice to kind of think through like, oh, what I'm sending may not necessarily be something that reflects back. So maybe I want to go ahead and test for other values. But we don't have any sort of like advanced logic going on here beyond just returning exactly what we've sent plus the room ID. So that's a lot of what we see here. And then we do a lookup by the room ID where we've got the room ID in the URL. And then we can go ahead and send that. And again, we're getting that same detail back as we got before. So I was able to reuse a lot of tests. For the other scenarios that I have here, the creating a room, updating room, it's the same sort of logic here of being able to update it and then going ahead and checking those values again. For the delete room, I actually get a 500 back for this one. So that lets you know that I cannot find that room that we just made and deleted. And then for the create room and get rooms, we're taking a look at all of the responses, all of the potential rooms that come back to see if the one that we just made is part of that group. So it's just talking through a little bit of that here. Now, I'm also going to run the entire collection and we will see how that goes. I occasionally get like socket hang-up errors and things like that, but hopefully it'll play ball with me for the moment here. So we're going to go, let's see, we're going to go run collection. We're going to do the whole thing. We're just going to do one pass. Now again, if we were doing the iteration data files that I mentioned earlier, we would pop them in here and then we could get even more passes here, but we're just having fun. So we're just using what's in the pre-request. So there you are. And you've got all of the names. Yay, great. Everybody passed. So everything's looking good. We have in these assertions, again, I mentioned that I threw in the name of the folder in here at the top because you otherwise don't get that information in here. So you can, it can kind of look like a sea of results. In this case, everything's passed, so things are looking good here. But if you have Newman or some other text-based way that you have your results, it can be helpful to have that extra detail. All right, so let's recap. We've got a collection of requests that can run in sequence to verify if the Rooms API is able to create rooms. They've all got a variety of assertions to verify that we're actually doing that successfully and happily. We have related functions that verify a few downstream processes, such as the deletion and updating that could be impacted if rooms could not be created, right? So we wanted to go ahead and test those, and we did. These are run successfully in Postman as is, so they could be exported for Newman, to run through Jenkins, GitHub Actions, or other, pipeline solutions, whatever you like. So my feedback on Postman and the tooling, right? The ease of use is difficult to beat. I'm definitely a Postman person. If you're already comfortable with JavaScript, it's really great for creating assertions. There are lots of other UI tools that you could import your API spec to that would likely work as well. Today, as I was setting up this recording, I actually ran into some odd UI bugs with copying and duplicating and moving requests around the hierarchy panel. I used the browser version of my account to get around that, but that was kind of a surprise. And unfortunately, in the years that I've used Postman so far, finding little quirky bugs from time to time, unfortunately, has become a bit of the norm for me, or I'm just a magnet for them, I'm not sure. We could have also, as I mentioned earlier, set this up to use iteration data files, test across different environments if there are others. But one thing that I will say for Postman is that if you have other frameworks that you'd like to have these results either feed into, or some way that they can play ball with other systems, it's tricky. And it wasn't in the scope of this exercise, but I didn't want to only give Postman a glowing review, so that's just another piece to consider there. Well, thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Jen Bauer. This was my entry for the Ministry of Testing API Challenge. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm also at jenbauer.com, so feel free to reach out, and I hope you have a good one. Take care.